We're live.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name's John Allen, and I work as the Executive Director of the Future of Infrastructure Group. And thank you for joining our Canada-UK roundtable today on a pretty rainy day in Toronto, hopefully a sunnier day in the UK. So the Future of Infrastructure Group is a group of leading start off on the wrong foot, a group of leading Canadian infrastructure companies working together with the public sector to really try and find solutions to some of the major issues facing the infrastructure sector in Canada. And I think one of the benefits, obviously, of the pandemic has been the potential to collaborate over video and Zoom and bring together a really leading group of experts from across the UK today and across Canada to share their views, their experiences as it pertains to the National Infrastructure Assessment, which was last launched by Canada at the end of March. And the UK undertook a similar process back in 2018, so there's lots to learn there. I would say today is being recorded. We encourage people to ask any questions and join in on the chat. And then I think we will start shortly by with Jeff and Magda from WSP and Pomelo, who'll be co-chairing our discussion. But first up, I'll hand over to Robert Judge and Gerard Peets from Infrastructure Canada, who are just going to give us a bit of background on what the National Infrastructure Assessment is and the process that you're undertaking there. So, Gerard.
Thanks a lot, John, and I'll hand it over to Robert to really kind of give a bit of an overview of the material, but maybe just to extend thanks for this to the Future of Infrastructure Group and to everyone who's showed up. We are in Canada embarking on our first ever National Infrastructure Assessment, and we're really at the beginning of the process. What we're doing right now is engaging with people, trying our best to learn from the experience of people like the UK, the folks in Australia and others, to really kind of get the process off on the right foot. I'm Gerard Peets. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister at Infrastructure Canada, responsible for policy, and I would say this is probably the top priority of our department, Infrastructure Canada, right now. We're exploring a number of themes that have kind of come up repeatedly in our early engagement, and for sure, one of them is data and evidence, and really kind of having a process that's driven by a solid, transparent methodology, so that whatever we come up with, we hope that people won't, people will be able to disagree on an informed view of how it was done. There won't be mysteries as to where things are coming from. And closely connected with that, I think, is the theme of independence. We understand, of course, that there's a role for independent advice, and of course, in a democracy, the main role in terms of decision making goes with elected officials, and that is at the federal, provincial, and municipal, as well as Indigenous level for us in Canada. So getting those roles right, I think, is a big one for us. And maybe the last theme that has come up quite often is the notion of how to drive priority setting, in the sense that if there's no constraint, then what you could end up with in an assessment is just a list of everything. So ideas like the fiscal remit that's been used, and learning and experience with that, but the pros and cons, I think, are of great interest to us. So perhaps with that brief intro, I'll turn it to my colleague, Robert Judge.
Thanks, Gerard. I'm Robert Judge. I'm the Director General of the team here at Infrastructure Canada that will be supporting the National Infrastructure Assessment. And let me just see if I can share my screen here. So, as John noted at the beginning, in March, we released an engagement paper seeking views on how to undertake Canada's first ever National Infrastructure Assessment. I'll try to be quick in my remarks. The Canadian participants on this call will have heard me last week on the Australia call, but for the benefit of our UK guests joining today, let me flip through these slides quickly. I don't have to persuade anybody on this call that infrastructure is central to a number of major public policy objectives for governments, including supporting economic growth, including tackling climate change, and including improving social equity. And as we look out to 2050, how these objectives will play out, well, we'll see that they'll play out in a very different context. Canada will be in a different place 2050 in terms of its climate, in terms of the size of its population and its economy, in terms of its demographics, and as we heard from the Australians last week, in terms of technology, in terms of geopolitics and supply chains, in terms of public expectations. All of these things suggest that thinking through how we want to maximize those core public policy objectives in 2050 would benefit from some strategic thinking in terms of the kinds of investments we need to be making in the infrastructure space. And we've seen both nationally and internationally folks pointing to the value of a strategic approach at a national level to infrastructure investment. And fortunately for us, there are those that have already been showing the way in the space, particularly the UK and Australia. And so we're super excited to benefit from this discussion today, following a very helpful conversation with the Australians last week. In terms of the engagement paper on how to undertake this independent, evidence-based national infrastructure assessment that Gerard was referring to, 3 priority areas for input were flagged in the paper. First, what do we think about the scope of the infrastructure sectors that should be addressed in the assessment? We know in the UK context that assessment focused more on economic infrastructure. What about collaboration and cooperation and some of the systemic issues that surround infrastructure investment? So building codes and standards, or skills training, or the use of digital tools and their common regulation. Are there areas for improvement on the collaboration front? And then finally, funding and financing. Are there innovative tools that we should be thinking through here? How should we approach funding and financing questions if we want to maximize the value of infrastructure investments in 2050? In terms of the anticipated timelines for the National Infrastructure Assessment here in Canada, I note that we're looking for feedback on this initial engagement on how to design the National Infrastructure Assessment by the end of June. This will then follow or be followed by a report on what we've heard in this engagement period, and that will set the stage for developing the mandate for the assessment, standing up the independent advisory body, and then the launch of the work itself, which ultimately we expect to be completed in terms of a published assessment by the end of, or rather by 2024. And so finally, in terms of immediate next steps for Canadian partners and stakeholders on the call, if you're not already contemplating a written submission to this initial engagement period, please do consider providing your views by June 30th. There is the engagement paper and the address for submitting your written feedback on the Infrastructure Canada website. And let me stop there and thank you for the opportunity to have presented this. Cheers.
Thank you, Robert and Gerard, for that introduction. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jeff Sider from WSP, who will be chairing the first part of the discussion, followed by Magda Sabat from Pomelo. So over to you, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Gerard and Robert. That was very helpful in setting the stage for this infrastructure assessment discussion. A few comments. We heard last week from Infrastructure Australia about their problems, their opportunities, and their challenges. And as someone said earlier in the discussion, or in the pre-meeting, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the UK and Australia. We want to make our own mistakes. I think that was Gerard. So this session then is one where we hope to gain a similar understanding as we did from Australia, from the UK, to understand what your successes, the challenges, and the opportunities that you've had. I'm going to lead the first half of the discussion. We're going to focus on laying the foundation. I have a few questions for Julia, for Isabel, and Rachel, if you want to start your videos. So Julia Prescott is the Commissioner of the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK and co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of the firm of Meridian. Isabel Dedring is the Global Transport Lead for Arup and former Deputy Mayor of London and advisor to the National Infrastructure Assessment. And then Rachel Skinner is the Executive Director of WSP in the UK, Chair of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and as well the former Infrastructure Commissioner for Scotland. So welcome and thank you for agreeing to join this. We'll follow this session with a session where Magda will lead Achieving Results, and we'll talk to Tim Chapman, Keith Waller, and Alexandra Bolton. So just to kick off the session, a question for Julia. The National Infrastructure Commission was established, as I understand it, in 2015 to provide impartial expert advice with a goal of driving better decisions on infrastructure, and hopefully one that transcends politics. In your opinion, has this been successful in achieving that aim? And secondly, what are the key aspects that make it appealing across party lines, which is always a big challenge?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jeff, and good afternoon to those in the UK and good morning to those in Canada. That's correct. I mean, the National Infrastructure Commission was formed in 2015. We went ahead and did our first National Infrastructure Assessment 2018, and we then got a response at the end of last year in the form of the National Infrastructure Strategy. Our next infrastructure assessment, will be the second, will come forward in 2023. And I would make the point that we're working hard, and we'll establish the baselines for that later on this year. So one point is that it takes a little time to evolve these assessments. And in the case of the UK government, it's taken a little time in relation to the first one to respond to it. But we've got our response. A number of policy issues have been responded to. And I'd have to say that the majority of the points we raised in that first infrastructure assessment have been taken on board by the current government. It's worth just stating our focus is really on economic infrastructure, and it's looking at supporting sustainable net growth with the expectation of net zero by 2050 in the UK. We're looking at improving competitiveness because of the, particularly thinking about the current approach towards levelling up. And we're also looking for improvement to the quality of life. And really, this is summarized by our strapline, which is better infrastructure for all. And in that context, I think actually as a response to your question, because we are looking at better infrastructure for all, because we are at arm's length from government, I think that the commentary we make, which is, and our proposals are very much data-based. We undertake rigorous analysis in relation to those recommendations. And I think another factor that is worth bearing in mind is that a lot of the infrastructure in the UK is actually financed by not just the public sector, but also the private sector. In fact, the majority is financed by the private sector. And we work with government under a current fiscal remit, 1.2%, but we also show transparently how the other investment that we make is reflected in people's bills. So this arm's length approach that we take, thinking of better infrastructure for all, not representing a government view, but an analytical, data-driven approach is very important to us. And I think this even goes to show that one of the first things we did, in fact, the last NIA, was to look at the actual data that are being collected by the public sector, by the private sector, in the context of how well infrastructure had performed. And we looked at that to see whether or not the whole sort of PPP type model, how well it had worked. The difficulty was that it actually, there was very little public data available. The private sector was slightly better. But what it meant was that we were actually looking at an inconclusive result, but what it drove through was the idea of data collection in the longer term. And that data collection, I think Keith will probably talk about in your next session, has actually led to project assurance. So again, repeating the point, because of the rigorous analysis, because of the data collection, because we are not seen as an arm of government, I think we get a response that goes across our respondents. It's not party political focused.
So Isabel, how do you see that the National Infrastructure Assessment fits in with wider initiatives from the National Infrastructure Commission to improve the infrastructure market and get more value from the investment?
Yeah, I think one of the, I just want to pick up one point that Julia was making there. I think this sort of focus on outcomes, I would say certainly the work that we did in London on the 2050 plan, and indeed, I think to a certain extent, the UKNIA, we've gone to a certain point, but it could go further, particularly areas that aren't comfortable for the infrastructure sector historically. So equity, leveling up, social value, whatever you want to call it, is one of the areas where there is a need to kind of be clearer about what are those outcomes we're aiming for, and therefore what infrastructure do we need, or is indeed an infrastructure solution at all the point? Decarbonization is another point. So I would just sort of re-emphasize the importance of outcomes. And I actually think there's an opportunity there for maybe Canada to lead the way, because none of the infrastructure assessments that have been done so far, you were talking about Australia, have really nailed that yet, partly because it's an evolving picture. So that's one point I would just sort of quickly make. I mean, I think just thinking back on the experience in the UK and also at the London level, one thing I would say we maybe got slightly wrong is the focus on the assessment and the report or the website or whatever it might be, and actually starting from who are the players in this market who are actually going to make a difference here, who do we need to get on board, and who's going to deliver this? And it isn't just the government, it isn't just the private sector, it isn't, whatever. And so how do we kind of start from the cohort of individuals that we want to bring together and then build the assessment and the reporting around that? It sounds kind of blindingly obvious, but I don't think, that's certainly not what's happened in the true kind of culture and tone of the way these things have been approached. And therefore, it kind of ends up sort of being a responsive type of scenario rather than a truly collaborative type scenario. So and then when the rubber hits the road and you're trying to deliver some of these projects, and it's about, you need 4, 5, 6 key players to deliver any large infrastructure project, you kind of having to bolt them on, later on in the process, let alone where's that skill set to really drive those projects forward, which is different from the skill set of identifying them. So I think that's the other point for me in terms of kind of making these exercises more effective, is how are we actually using this as the way of building up a kind of proto way of working within the industry, which is in many cases different from the way the industry has worked traditionally. Very linear, very throwing things over the wall, the planners send it to the engineers, send it to the operators. How do we actually break that? Because it doesn't deliver great outcomes for the public or indeed for our infrastructure industry as a whole. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I think that's the heart of getting this right, really.
Interesting on your earlier comment as well. One of the points that Australia made was the change in focus from an asset-centric focus to one which is more services, people, and places. So really outcome based. What are we trying to achieve by this this assessment?
And I don't think there is an actual model for that. You know, I can't look at, there's not someone who's got that right yet. So I think that's actually really interesting opportunity at this point in time for this exercise to really get it right. You talked about Indigenous people earlier. You know, Canada's quite well placed in time and in its sort of ethos and where it is at the moment to maybe really make a mark on that and kind of set the tone for subsequent assessments as well.
And it's very much the ESG focus that investment houses are looking at as well.
Yeah, which is the other aspect that people haven't quite got right yet, right? It's like, oh, we came up with our brilliant plan, right? Where's all the money? The Canadian pension funds answer to all finance questions ever. So you obviously aren't going to have any problems because you already have the pension funds. But it's funny how people just think, oh, right, okay, we've got our plan and now here comes the money. So it's building that in earlier on.
So Rachel, how much is culture an issue within the public sector and the private sector, and how can you drive change to be more innovative, cooperative, and solutions focused? Because with the whole P3 model, innovation went out the window in many respects, which was originally supposed to foster innovation.
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, the really short answer to how important is culture, I mean, it's absolutely the thing that underpins the success of whether or not people are actually going to change the way they want to do things, or whether they'll just spend their time looking for a different solution that better suits whatever it is they wanted to do to begin with, I suppose. So what springs to mind actually, partly in answer to your question, but also just picking up on some of the points we've just been hearing there from Julia and from Isabel. I spent 2 years as an infrastructure commissioner in Scotland, as was mentioned just in the introduction there. It was a slightly different model to the National Infrastructure Commission, in the sense that Scotland has the devolved powers to be able to have its own infrastructure commission and to make its own decisions and so on. And one of the things that came through very early on, which actually I think was partly timing, if I'm honest, and partly learning from the NIC experience, but also to do with perhaps a little bit of the Scottish need to be slightly different to the rest of the UK, just on sort of principle. We spent 2 years as a group of 10 commissioners coming up with what was essentially over a 30-year horizon, coming up with infrastructure strategy to 2050. Very early on, it became very obvious that the only way to get across that sort of cultural fit through some of the policy recommendations we were trying to make and so on was to actually loop in as many of the social infrastructure elements as possible, rather than just having a focus on the economic infrastructure sectors. So we actually ended up looking across, it must have been close to 15 different parts of just the way the whole world of infrastructure goes together. So in addition to transport, water, energy, waste, digital and so on, we also got into everything to do with health and education and justice and green blue infrastructure and so on. That actually opened up a completely different set of conversations around, I guess it got to the outcomes piece, but it also allowed us to get across the sectors and start to understand the different motivations for change within some of those sectors, and I guess the appetite for change. It let us get into conversations around the bigger multi-sector systems and places where obviously all of these different things intersect and so on, which actually I thought was really very healthy. Now, I would say in sort of offering that, the Scottish scale is very different to either the NIC side of things, or indeed the Canadian side of things. So Scotland has 5,000 people, 5 million people, sorry, just to put it into perspective. I guess just commenting a little bit on that outcome focus, which I think is probably the rallying cry around which you get some of that cultural shift to start to happen. We, from a Scottish perspective, picked up very quickly. Well, I say very quickly. Actually, it probably took about 6 months of discussion back and forth between commissioners. But it became obvious that we needed some sort of hinge points or hooks, if you like, to put all the different policy recommendations onto, to avoid this, enormous range of recommendations which otherwise had no reference to each other and no way of hanging together. So, in a Scottish context, what we came to were basically two big themes. One of them was around inclusive growth. And I suppose in the COVID context, you'd now probably reframe that as around inclusive recovery. But the other one was net zero carbon. And the timing of that was interesting, because of course that was all happening at the point where, from a UK perspective, some of those pieces were being formalised into a proper legal mandate and so on in terms of our 2050 target, although Scotland, again, in the interests of being distinct and different, has a 2045 policy mandate in terms of trying to get to net zero by 2045. So I think, I mean, hopefully there are pieces in there in terms of the extent to which culture really does matter. It feels that there has to be a way of connecting whatever these recommendations are, whatever it is you want to fund and finance and so on. You have to be able to connect it back to the things that in a public engagement sense people actually can identify with, and they say, yes, I want that, and if this is a piece of that picture, then I am keen on it. And as I say, I think going across both the social and economic infrastructure pieces of that was really quite a helpful and I guess a healthy process in terms of being able to start to open up different dimensions to that conversation.
So just following on from that, a question for actually both you and Rachel and Isabel. One, as former infrastructure commissioner for Scotland, and Rachel as former deputy mayor of London. Let's start with you, rather Isabel as former deputy mayor of London. Starting with you, Rachel, how can central government drive improvement across the country around planning and delivery? So a question for both you, Rachel, and for Isabel.
My brief start, and I'm sure Isabel, knowing you as I do, I'm sure we can build on this. I would say that the key, no matter what your plan or your strategy, whatever it is, whatever it actually says, the key is to try to come up with something that is sufficiently, I don't want to say simple because these things are never simple, but something that has a headline that everybody can actually sort of start to drive towards, and that they can adopt in their own context. One of the things, I mean, again, this doesn't really have to be in a Scottish context, it can be anywhere, and I know it would apply in Canada just the same as it does over here. Obviously, everybody is starting in terms of different communities and places and I guess, political areas and so on. Everybody is starting in a different place by way of context. Everybody is perhaps trying to get to a slightly different place and has different ideas around the timeline within which they want to do that. But if they could see that there is something in there for them in terms of, real positive, I guess, productive progress, then they are much more likely to want to adopt it and support it, rather than spending time trying to find ways to go around it or to slow it down or to otherwise sort of, I suppose, dodge the policy direction of travel that's being set. And I think, I mean, that really comes through very clearly, and I'm sure it does in Canada as well, knowing it slightly as I do. I think, the difference between, for example, the experience of the city centres, the urban core, and the disparity, and the very, very great difference in terms of the vast expanses of rural and essentially almost open space in the grand scheme of things. The needs are very different, the priorities are very, very different, but can we find a way, in a simple sense, to get everybody heading in the same direction? That is, to me, the key in terms of how centrally you could actually drive some of that change forward.
And I agree with all of that, Rachel, and as usual,
of course.
yeah, I mean, I think maybe the thing that, thinking about it now, looking backwards, right, the risk with these exercises is it's like the aim is the assessment, right? And actually what we're trying to do, my opinion, is create a better way of working in this industry. This isn't UK specific, Canada specific, whatever. It's not an industry that has a very good or effective way of working across public-private, across different silos. What, highways people don't really talk to rail people, who don't really talk to buildings people, who don't really talk to bridge people. So if our starting point is a more effective and leveraged way of working and true partnership working, never mind, PPP as an arid concept, right? If we could get to that, how can we use this process as a way of driving that sort of behavior? And that's, the magic outcome, right? So for example, when we did the exercise in London, the 2050 exercise, and Rachel was actually involved in that back in the day, as was Zara before I joined, we kind of did the thing, and it was really interesting. Report is really revealing. It's the first time we pulled all the stuff together. So that in itself, you can kind of geek out about the fact that for the first time, you've got the pipeline in one place and you've got the visibility across the sector. sectors. But then it was like, actually, how do we now coordinate this and drive this forward? And then we kind of had to invent that off the back of the report that we'd done. And actually, if we start with that and then work backwards into what does the way of working need to look like, never mind this moment in time where we're producing an assessment, or every 3 years we're producing an assessment. I think that's the crux of this, because there's a lot of passivity in the industry. I think, certainly when I was on the government side, there's a lot of kind of like, well, we don't have certainty. And we don't have clarity about the pipeline. It's like, well, what have you done to create certainty or clarity about the pipeline? How can we together try and create that? So the risk is that kind of sense of like, we need certainty, kind of that burden gets placed on the shoulders of this exercise. There is never going to be an amount of certainty that people want. Inevitably, all infrastructure is political. And therefore, inevitably, it has uncertainty within it. And we all need to embrace that, accept that, and just move on with our lives and build our way of working around that. So, you don't want to kind of get burdened by that. You want to almost design for agility, design for flexibility and collaborative working. And what kind of website do you need for that? What kind of steering group? What kind of, pace of refresh? What kind of execution capability do you need to link into as well downstream? Who is going to then take these things and deliver them? All of that has to be, where the thinking starts, in my view.
That's a good point. Just moving on to a little bit about financing, if we can talk about that for a moment. Julia, I've got 2 questions for you. How well are different procurement models and financing options incorporated into decision making in the first instance? And secondly, where do you see private financing play more of a role in the future, and what's holding it back? Actually, 3 questions.
Well, actually, in sort of true style, I'd also like to make a very quick response as well to what's already been said, if you will allow me the indulgence.
Absolutely.
One thing I would make, the first point about systems, I think it's extraordinarily important to look at infrastructure as systems rather than as standalone projects, which has often been the case previously. And I'll link that into a quick response about ESG, because one of the papers I was recently involved in is the Natural Capital and Environmental Net discussion paper that was put out by the NIC. And there we were looking at, in a natural capital context, the system of particularly in relation to flooding. So we thought about potentially having natural capital solutions that would help with flooding down the road. And as part of that, I want to stress the very strong ESG focus that is at the NIC, and also in the context of looking at resilience and future shocks. But the other point I make as well is public consultation is absolutely critical in bringing together groups. Not only do we bring together expert panels, we bring experts, we consult, and the fantastic thing about having such an organization is you can actually add as a convening organization, which is very important, as well as having public consultations. It's just great as people involved in infrastructure to hear what the public think. Now, that's my response. I think that connectivity is happening as far as it is able, the National Infrastructure Commission, in terms of that convening power. And also, I think it's very important to say that this systematic vote, and particularly incorporating ESG, is critical. But I think we want to move on to private finance and where we are with private finance. And I think the UK has got this very heavy private finance engagement in terms of the development and indeed ownership of its infrastructure. And one of the things that we've been looking at in the Commission is actually how this regulatory structure, the regulatory system that underpins this private finance, can really help investment in a strategic way. And we issued a paper on this topic. And I think the two key areas was really making sure that the regulators were not necessarily single focused, but they were incorporating the really key important things at the moment, such as net zero goals, and that they were looking at investing in resilience. Now, these are 2 very key items that actually balance that very consumer-focused remit that was very much the sort of regulatory duty previous to that. And I think the other area that we looked at is then coming back to the innovation point, which has already been mentioned, and it's really looking at the increased use of competition to drive that innovation, not having everything done by the regulatory, the regulated utilities, but actually saying for strategic investments, these could be carved out and have a standalone competition. And I think one of the things that we really saw within that we needed to balance the relationship between the consumers and regulated utilities. And so that we actually made sure that there was a risk and reward element there that actually allowed the consumers to see that their interests were being taken into account. And a final point I'll pick up on that, and I think it's mentioned in some of the papers, is talking about distributional analysis. I think that's a very key point. It's something we're really coming back to in the NIA, in that market design doesn't always take account of distributional analysis. It assumes more of a homogeneity, which, to be frank, doesn't exist. We know that decisions hit different parts of the population. And I think it's something that we're certainly looking at, as I said, in the NIA. So coming back to the point of where do we get to with regulation and regulatory assets, this is something where we're expecting a policy paper from the government next year, which again shows the interaction between NIC coming up with papers, government responding. Final point I make about really looking at another relationship between private finance and actually getting things done, is that we have seen a focus shifting from the what somebody I think called it sterile, I can't remember what it was, sterile or something else, PPP approach. But what we're now seeing is is using the elements that were effective out of the PPP approach, and rather looking at the general taxpayer base to repay in, again, a rather sort of blanket fashion. What we're looking at is, particularly in the water sector, the DPC type contracts that are for standalone, but they look specifically at the bill payer to be the one that will repay specific investments rather than the general taxpayer. And that is because the water utilities are actually issuing tenders in the context of these strategic investments, and it will be the water utilities that form the repayment or the funding side of the financing, both debt and equity, that is raised in respect to these strategic investments. So just generally, and that's a rather long answer because I did want to get my response back into the earlier questions, but I wanted to talk about where private finance is going, and very happy to talk as well a little bit later on. You may wish others to talk about who is going to pay the bill. We've all got massive infrastructure requirements, but we must recall at the end of the day who's going to pay the bill.
A very interesting point, and also not you'll recall the tax the TIFs, tax increment financing, which is going back to those days of looking at them, how to pay for it all. A second last question for the session to Isabel and to Rachel, both because you have the unfortunate role of getting back into advisory work as consultants. We're seeing a greater emphasis on life cycle costs, rightly so, whole life, looking at the whole life aspect of it, and value in procurement. What sort of benefits is this having on projects, and what are the barriers for more widespread adoption? So, how about Rachel, you go first, Isabel second, and then I have a final question for you all.
Sure, no, fine, thank you. So yes, greater emphasis on sort of whole life thinking, I suppose, and yeah, what benefits is that, and what barriers are coming through, I guess. I think from my own perspective, and kind of just taking a fairly broad view on this one, it feels that we are, from a UK perspective as a whole, we are definitely on the way now in terms of proper or at least best current practice, shall we say, in terms of whole life appraisal. And I think there is a growing recognition, although again, this isn't sort of fully rolled out and embedded yet, around the need to think much more around the long run value of an investment, whether it's infrastructure or anything else, rather than purely actually about the cost of that investment up front and what that actually looks like, which I think if we are honest with ourselves, cost has been taking precedence over that long run whole life value, pretty much to now, if as I say, we're being brutally honest with ourselves. I suspect we're going to come on a lot more to this in the next part of the session, so I won't say too much more about that now. But I think that there's no doubt that some of these long run issues now seem to matter much more than perhaps they used to, and maybe they've always mattered, but it seems that perhaps in the last year or two, in the context of COVID and in the context of the climate emergency, which, you know, in terms of a sort of a dual header of agenda topics, it does feel this is bringing some of these longer run whole life issues to the fore, and it feels also now that we really can't afford not to change on this particular front. So I suppose just to pick out two things in particular, and in fact it picks up really nicely on Julia's point just now as well. The first, and to me the really obvious one, where the way we've done infrastructure or the way we've made decisions around infrastructure to now has been effectively blind to a rather large bucket of issues, is the piece around climate change, the piece around the need for climate action. And I'm talking there both about the, if you like, the attack strategy for carbon reduction and the pieces around mitigation of climate change, but also the defence strategy to do with resilience and making sure that we're adapting for what will be decades ahead of a worsening climate. We know we need to do both of these things, and yet none really of our infrastructure decisions in the grand scheme of things have really taken full account of those impacts properly until now. Even if on the surface, you know, you can read about it within the appraisal paperwork and so on, have decisions really turned on that? If we're brutally honest again, I think there's a long way to go on that, and it's definitely going to be something that needs to come to the fore. And the other one picks up exactly on what Julia was saying to do with that distributional impact of infrastructure. You know, who are we helping, who are we leaving behind? And the fact this isn't just a sort of whole great big regional problem, this is also an issue within small neighborhoods and communities, even within households, in terms of the impact, the benefits, the costs and so on of actually what we decide to do and what we decide not to do. In the UK, some of you may be aware that we're talking about this as levelling up, as sort of a phrase that's being used in a political sense at the moment, but really it's a catch-all term which is well, it was a political commitment, but I think it's coming through much more strongly now off the back of COVID and the fact that actually we are seeing some of these social inequalities so much more clearly through the lens of the pandemic. And we're really beginning to understand actually, right, we do need to do this very, very differently. So I think that there is an awful lot of benefit to be gained, I suppose, by thinking about areas like that. Not to say it's easy, but it's definitely an area we need to be thinking about. In terms of barriers to the adoption of some of that kind of thinking. I mean, I guess just to pick on two briefly, and then I'll hand over to Isabel. But the first one is obviously any time you're asking somebody to change the methods they use, if you're asking them to do a different type of appraisal and so on, you know, it takes a while, doesn't it, to settle into a rhythm of that, to agree on what the method is going to be, that kind of thing, and to stop silly game playing, which really doesn't help at all in terms of trying to get this whole thing to work. But I suppose the other, I guess the other piece to all of this is actually in some cases we're going to have to be getting a lot more comfortable with uncertainty, because we don't know all of the answers. They aren't things that can be quantified as risks in the grand scheme of things. So anybody doing work in this strategic infrastructure space is going to have to get to a point where we sort of have to take a bit of a leap of faith, I think, around some of these wider, difficult to quantify issues. Make sure we really are thinking them through in terms of the investments that are made, but then take that leap of faith and say, actually, investing in these things will almost without doubt be better than not investing in whatever that thing is.
Nice segue to Isabel, uncertainty.
Yeah, so I think this whole point around kind of, the whole life thing, I think one of the things that's been problematic is that it's sort of articulated as this perfect bubble. It's very purist, right? So that bears no relationship to the world most people live in, and therefore it never happens, because it's like, if you don't do this perfect thing, whole life, it's the circle, then you failed. So who wants to start trying that? Because you kind of know you're going to fail, don't you? So I think in this exercise, thinking about the infrastructure assessment process, two thoughts. One is picking some areas where we can kind of focus on embedding it rather than trying to eat the whole elephant, whether that's sectors, whether that's projects, whether that's a particular point in the life cycle, and really thinking about that as a kind of, wedge in the door, or, the first big step forward would be helpful, and will help to kind of move this along. I think most of the industry globally is still in very, very early days, as Rachel's saying there. We all get it intellectually. It's how you actually embed that in a highly fragmented linear industry and process. The sort of message of hope element of it maybe is that, the more that we have partnerships to deliver these pieces of infrastructure, the more we overcome that problem. So simplistically, if you have a developer that's helping to invest in a railway station or a piece of railway, they are going to be thinking about what happens when the thing is up and running, much more than the person who's building the thing, or indeed the person who's going to maybe operate the asset itself. They're going to be thinking about the outcomes, the placemaking, et cetera. So just simplistically, if you have a developer, railway authority, or city partnership, you are going to get those outcomes brought right into the heart of the project, purely through the underlying joint venture structure and the funding and the finance approach. So the more that we can bring those partnership type approaches, never mind PPP, but where you're collaboratively delivering something, the more you'll be outcome focused, and the more you'll get that whole life approach. It'll just result from the natural incentives of the people at the table. So how can this process, this assessment process in Canada, kind of help to drive that and encourage and support that, rather than what so often happens, which is people say, oh, sure, I know Hong Kong does that with MTR, and I know London did that with Crossrail, but would never work here for fill in the blank reasons, which is what most people say around the world. It's just not relevant in our market, it can't work, et cetera. So how do we kind of get over that? And Canada's actually got a pretty good, sort of way of thinking about this now. So you're kind of a bit, ahead of a lot of other markets that are just think it's not for them. And how do we accelerate that?
And we've had the success that you and Australia have done before us. I'd like to thank you, all the three of you, for this informative discussion. I'm going to hold my last question till then, because I know Magda is anxious to get going on looking at the results that it's all going to generate. So let's move on to that. Thanks again, Julia, Isabel, and Rachel. I really appreciate your time. And Gerard, I'm sure you'll have some animated discussion on the outcomes of this discussion. Over to you, Magda.
All right, thank you, Jeff, and good day to all. I would like to actually ask the current panelists to maybe turn your cameras back on and stay on as we as we move on to the second portion and looking at action and getting results. Laying the foundation, the assessment is important to then now look at how we're going to be implementing and how do you bring that forward and achieve the objectives. And the three panelists that I'll mostly direct my questions to are Tim Chapman, who is the Director of Infrastructure Design at AREP, and also on the Technical Advisory Group for the UK National Infrastructure Commission. Keith Waller, the Program Director, Construction Innovation Hub, who developed the Value Toolkit, and we'll have some questions on that. And Alexandra Bolton, the Executive Director for the Centre for Digital Built Britain. However, before, and of course I invite other panelists to chime in as well as I pose the questions. We did get a question here for the panelists from the audience, so I might actually pause before we get into our questions and just pose this question. I think it might be good for Julia to respond to. As the globe is recovering and considering the level of liquidity available in the market and floor interest rates, how do you see inflation affecting the investments going into infrastructure?
Yes, I did see the question, and very happy to respond to it. I think I will respond really focusing on two areas. First of all, the pipeline and the speed at which projects are going down the pipeline. I think one of the things that we're seeing is an inflation in underlying costs, particularly the elements of construction. Now, as we see that, we may see two things. One is, as I say, speed. Will people stop, think again, see how that's going to impact their overall cost profile going forwards? see whether or not it's going to be effective to do infrastructure now, or will there be a need of sort of reshuffling of the pipeline? And so I think that's one thing that we may see, and we may see that inflation working through. Hopefully the view is that this is a spike rather than ongoing high levels of inflation. So with any luck, if we see any delays, this will be smoothed out over time. The second area I talk about is from the respect of the investor community. Now, one of the views with inflation coming back in is that the investor community, which is, there's very significant volumes of money looking to go into infrastructure at the moment, that investor community would be deflected, that they would look at greater interest in sort of shorter term corporate approaches. Two things on that. One, there's a lot of volume of money, and the reason is not just necessarily for return, but also the perceived security of investment in infrastructure. And the second area is that I think now, as we go forward, people will see that there are actually, a benefit on an overall portfolio basis to having some inflation in the returns that they can get. So from those two areas, potentially shorter term ructions, but I think over time, then it, hopefully things will work into the process.
Okay, thank you. This will be a good segue into looking at the first question. As the UK has developed its first assessment and used that as a basis for developing a strategy for implementation, and now is embarking on the next phase of the assessment for 2023. This question is for Tim. In seeing the assessment and looking at the strategy, moving that forward and implementing, how is this translating to change on the ground on projects?
Thanks, Magda. That's a really interesting question. It's very difficult to say because to some extent, it's quite early days. I mean, the NIC and the NIA have produced, it's only had a few years, and big infrastructure projects take years or decades to happen. If I use the example of Crossrail. So Crossrail was a new railway line in London first proposed by Abercrombie in 1943, so time of World War II. I first worked on it in 1992. I spent about a year in 1992 doing the site investigation through the middle of London for it. I then went on to design ticket holes. It started probably as one big continuous process, so that the bill then failed. It then came back again for a second bite of the cherry, or third or fourth bite of the cherry. We started actually designing it, going through bill powers and everything else from about 2002, 2003. It went through House of Commons, finally got powers around about 2007, 2008. And then it only narrowly survived the recession in 2008. It was sort of ushered through by some very senior politicians who kept it going from the transition from Labour to Tory government. And basically, once they started digging holes, it became unstoppable. But it took many decades to start digging the holes that made it unstoppable. And to be fair to that process, it made sure it was actually a really, really well-required railway line. It was long, it was tedious. It could have actually been stopped many times, but it was a very, very well-refined design. Hopefully, it's finally going to start in 2022. So I'll have worked on it for over a 30-year period in my career, from actually the first site investigation I was involved with to it actually opening. And if you contrast that with the usual political cycle of 4 to 5 years and sort of the political interest periods, then you start to realize why the work that you're about to embark on is so important. Because these big infrastructure projects take decades to happen. I mean, in some ways, the effects take centuries to actually properly come to fruition, to make the great places they're going to do. Certainly half a century to come to full fruition, where all of the outcomes start to actually come through. And I think we in the UK suffered hugely. So in the UK invested quite a lot in the 1960s, early 1970s in infrastructure, and then virtually nothing for maybe 2 or 3 decades. Levels of investment were very low. Julia mentioned in her talk, I think the 1.2% sort of level that the government has now said they're going to do going forward. So removing projects from being a political football, I think, is the hugely ambitious side of this. And as I look at now, I see some other huge, big, multi-decade projects like East-West Rail, sort of going between the 2 university towns. Transpennine Road, linking the various big northern cities with high-speed electrified railway lines. And I don't see these being the political footballs they once were. I see a cross-party consensus that now actually allows people who know what they're doing to come up and sort of come to the right answers. I hugely agree with democratic accountability in what we're doing. But when that democratic accountability lurches from policy to policy to policy, and means that the country can't come to a consensus to create the right infrastructure, to create the paradigm that allows generations to have aspirations, to change the social outcome in various places, then you realize we need to do it differently and better. With the weekend, I was reading the New York Times account of the new the Golden Line in Mexico City that collapsed. And again, I mean, if that had actually been designed with a longer period of gestation, there'd be more care that went into it. I mean, I believe one of the issues was, I mean, there was obviously ignoring the structural ones that led to the viaduct failing. They bought trains that were had wheels designed for European track, running them on North American steel for the rails. That meant that there was always a hugely bad rail train interface on these lines, which may cause it to be a really uncomfortable line to actually ride on. And I'd like to believe that we don't make those sort of mistakes in the future. I think there's a whole new paradigm that was actually being created here. I think the NIA was the first start of it, but actually Keith's going to talk later on about the construction playbook and the CIH value toolkit. In the UK, we also have the Climate Change Commission and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. There's a series of policy professionalizing everything we do and making sure that these decade-long projects create the right outcomes for society that we all dream of.
All right, thank you. You mentioned the construction playbook, and I'll pass it on to Keith in a moment. But having talked about looking at long-term and that these projects take a long time to develop, one of the things in the construction playbook talks about the need to publish project pipelines. And we're in the market here in Canada. That's something that the market has been asking for from the different levels of government to be able to see and prepare for what is coming down the pipeline. Where does the UK stand on that, and what difference is it making?
Again, Keith will probably answer this in more detail because it was time in the IPA, but I think the Infrastructure Project Authority used to produce a pipeline, and actually there's some really good people who maintain it, but there wasn't always a commitment to actually doing it. So there's a difference between actually having a pipeline, which is actually really good and hopefully actually is prioritized, and knowing it's really going to come to fruition. And I think what we're starting to do in the UK is create long programs of work. And I think Rachel spoke about in Scotland the marrying of social and economic infrastructure, which I hugely agree with. I used to be an economic infrastructure person and very proud of it, but I now come to realize that actually some of the big advantages of the thinking that we're doing comes through in social infrastructure, as in the ability to have a program of hospitals or a program of schools where you do them in a similar way, make sure you learn from them, a bit like sort of we have with the iPhone or Samsung or whatever else. You have a research route map. There's lots of things that you can try and do if you have these long programs, but the discipline of creating a program of work like that is really, really difficult. Not to have people looking at each school as a local political football designed for its own particular circumstances. And the industry can come together. I mean, Isabel spoke about the professionalizing of the industry, giving us a chance to actually develop hugely. And I think having the pipeline does that. But the discipline of the pipeline is actually making sure you start to group similar projects together. And then we can start to actually look at a proper way of building off-site and modern methods of manufacture. We can start to look at better ways of lodging the outcomes with society. We can actually have better dialogues with communities about what we're trying to create. So I think there's a whole lot of things come together. The NIA is a startup. In the UK, we've actually had a plethora of initiatives which are only now coming to fruition. And I'm hugely optimistic for the future of the industry, like I haven't been in the past.
Can I just come in on that really quickly, Magda? Just to say, I was on a call the other day with a bunch of industry people and senior people at the Department for Transport. And first of all, there's numerous published pipelines in the UK, and everyone on the call is like, oh, what? Never seen it, don't know about it. And then the other people were like, I've seen it, but it's out of date, or is it? Or, you know, are you really committed to it? And what do you really think? And which one is really the most important? So the point is, whatever you publish, the minute you publish it, people are going to either misunderstand it, not want to understand it, et cetera. So what we were exploring on the call was actually having, again, a way of working. So a quarterly call between senior industry people and senior government people to talk about the pipeline. and talk about how it's changing and how our priorities changing. Priorities will change. That's life. We all need to, again, embrace that, move on. And actually, so it's thinking about what's the kind of, these sort of connection points. And actually, there's never going to be the static pipeline. It's about how we talk to each other. Once a month, there's an open call, or once a quarter. I think it sounds really mechanical and boring, but that would really change the understanding in the industry about it. So I would consider those sorts of interventions as part of doing this work.
And Magda, great danger of hijacking your session. I just also wanted to make a point. one of which, and this is wearing a bit of a private sector hat here, one of the great benefits of the National Infrastructure Commission is that we have got a number of disciplines involved. This is my private sector hat discipline. One of the issues about the pipeline, if you're in a country like the UK, which has over half of its infrastructure being financed by the private sector, is a focusing on investability of projects within pipelines, of segmentation of the various elements of the pipeline. Some things are very early stage, some things could attract in private finance. And I think there's a great danger in all these UK pipelines that Isabel is talking about, that they're just sort of thrown on the wall and people are meant to take an interest in them. Focus your pipeline. I won't do any more hijacking.
No, absolutely, and I welcome others as well to hijack just as in a similar fashion.
Oh, you'll be so sorry, Magda. Big mistake.
I will direct this next two questions to Keith. It is tying into what we've been talking about right now, and Isabel and Julia, what you've brought up as well, I think. Keith, as the program director for the Construction Innovation Hub and having developed the Value Toolkit, so the Construction Innovation Hub is a unique entity. We would like to hear more about what are the main challenges that you are trying to address, and how has this steered the work of the organization, such as the National Infrastructure Commission. I do have a follow-up question about the construction playbook as well, after this as well.
Okay, well, thanks. So I think there's sort of three elements that need to fit together for Canada's approach to learn from perhaps some of the mistakes and some of the things we've done reasonably well here. And I've been in a sort of slightly fortunate position to be involved in the very first National Infrastructure Plan we produced in 2010. I have been involved in throwing at the wall every single full pipeline that the government has published since 2011. And now, and I can talk a bit about why we published the pipeline, why governments published the pipeline and for what purpose in that space. But the three elements I think is crucial to get right. There's firstly what the National Infrastructure Commission are here to do and have done through their NIA, is really to say, where do we want to be in 30 years' time? Where are we now? What are the gaps we need to plug to bridge that based on our fiscal mandate in there? So it's where do we want to be? Where are we now? What are the things we need to do? Then it's the second job, it's the job of the government of the day to set out its policy, regulation, spending plans over the next parliament that says, right, based on that assessment, here are some things, projects we're going to commit to that help move us along that 30-year path. It doesn't get us there, but it moves us on that journey. So take the national infrastructure assessment that comes through and then set out the policy, spending, regulatory plans that will enable that, recognising that about 60% of the investment is delivered through the private sector, as we've said earlier. And then the third element, if we've got, this is what we need in the long term, then we've got, this is what we're going to spend our money on or commit to over the short to medium term, is that the often overlooked, then how do we do it in a way that supports these broader objectives? So if we are going to do a particular project or program of works, how can we do it in a way that supports some of our strategic policy objectives? How does it support a path to net zero? How does it enable us to build productive capacity in our economy? How does it support levelling up? How does it deliver better social impact? And actually getting that responsibility for whose job is it to set out what our long-term vision is of where we want to be through our infrastructure. Understanding whose role it is then to set out the policy and spending and regulatory interventions that are going to be made to support that journey, and then who is taking a lead in improving how we deliver it. It's not just a case of putting it there by whatever means necessary. How do we deliver it in a way that supports, all of those good objectives? And of course, we know that public and private sector clients are really having to operate in a very complex policy environment, be it through climate change, be it through social impact, be it through the needs of their investors, ethical finance, green finance, and so on. They have to navigate quite a complex environment. And so when we see things like a requirement that government sets out, Boris's plan, 10-point plan, how does that relate to infrastructure? How does it relate to what we do? How do we actually make sure we do it in a way? And one of the reasons in the hub that we've sort of focused on a number of elements in our program. We're funded as an R&D program through government, but the Construction Innovation Hub is and is not and will not be a market player. Our job is to enable the market to succeed. It's to help organisations like WSP and Arup and the contractors to innovate and grow and thrive. So we want to try and create the right environment. So we have to do three things, really. Firstly, we have, through our funding, we have to try and develop solutions or products that support the ambitions that we have for the construction and infrastructure sector in the UK. That may be around digital transformation, around greater levels of manufacturing, around accelerating a path to net zero, all of those sort of areas. So we have to sort of try and develop some solutions, working in partnership with government and industry. But that isn't enough by itself. Alongside that, we have to try and work with government, and we do, to try and shape the policy environment so it is benign to those sort of innovations coming forward. At the moment, there is a disconnect between strategic policy objectives and how they're translated into action on individual projects and programs. So it's how do we help de-risk it for government, investors, for clients, to try and adopt these more productive, sustainable ways of delivering infrastructure. And then thirdly, we have to work with the market so they have the right capability and capacity to be able to respond. So if government wants to increase the amount of sustainable manufactured schools it puts forward, how do we make sure there is the appetite in government to want to do that? How do we make sure there's the technical solutions are there in a way that deliver the needs of the funders and the needs of the users and the needs of society, and how do we build capacity and capability in there? So I think one of the questions you asked, Magda, was, how are we shaping what the National Infrastructure Commission are doing? I don't think we are in that sense. What we are doing is we're responding to that strategic direction of where do we want to be, and trying to develop the solutions and the approaches and the processes and the tools that enable us to get there, but working with governments and clients so they're able to ask for it in a better way, with the right commercial models, commercial strategies, delivery models, and the way they set out their requirements and they engage with the market, and also working with consultants and contractors and manufacturers to make sure they're developing those solutions. Because one of the things we will see increasingly, as Rachel rightly said, it's not just around an increasing focus on whole life performance, whole life carbon, and accelerating that path in terms of a transition to a net zero economy. We have to look at other things around how we levelling up and increasing the social impact. How do we actually make sure we're able to service much of this need in the UK? How do we make sure we're doing it in a way that delivers quality and safety? So, we have to not respond passively to the policy environment. We have to try and help shape it. But in doing so, we need to make sure that we are working with government, with investors, with clients, and with industry. So we have the right capability and capacity to deliver the projects and programs and that investment in a way that meets the needs, the infrastructure needs, but also enables us to deliver, a transformed, more sustainable, more profitable, more ethical construction sector that delivers it. So our job is to enable that market, and we do that really by developing a few things with our partners, by shaping the environment and trying to build capability and capacity to be able to respond.
All right, thank you. On the topic of publishing pipelines and reconfirming those pipelines and confirming whether this is the list of projects that is going forward and how that's changing, and to the point that Keith that you're talking about now in terms of providing kind of a value toolkit, the value toolkit to promote a better implementation of those projects. Can you add a little bit more on the how the initiatives in the value toolkit rebuild the trust between clients and contractors?
So absolutely. So I mean, part of, if we build that up from the pipeline, so the first pipeline was published in the UK in 2011, and in fact it was two pipelines. There was an infrastructure pipeline and there was a construction pipeline. And they really set out those projects and programs that government or private sector clients had largely committed to. And they were relatively short term. And of course, as years went by and we got to the end of various spending or regulatory periods, the size of the pipeline was going down because, you know, we'd spent some of it moving forward. So a decision was taken about 5 years ago to put out a 10-year pipeline, which is around £600 billion in that sort of order of magnitude, which is made up of those short-term projects over the next, say, 3 to 5 years that departments or clients have committed to, you know, that be that things like HS2 or Crossrail or a particular schools programme, but also based on the National Infrastructure Commission's fiscal remit and what the regulators are saying and what we know about government spending plans. We'll say, yeah, if we take schools as one particular example, we might have 100 schools that government is committed to do over the next 5 years. But in the following 5 years, they have said they're going to continue to spend that sort of level of money. So we're not putting it, weren't putting it against individual projects, but that was really in response to what the market asked for is, are we running up to a cliff edge or a brick wall? Or is there a longer term intent that we're going to keep investing in our transport or our energy or our utility networks or our public buildings? So industry said to us, we want some certainty in the short term and some clearer, longer term direction of travel. So we ended up with 10 years is about the right sort of number. But of course, just publishing the pipelines, as Isabel and Julia said, just by themselves really doesn't quite cut it. It's then how does that enable us to sort of, through publishing that pipeline, start to understand what do we want to get out of that investment. If we're investing £60 billion a year in our economic and social infrastructure as a nation, you know, what are those broader outcomes we want from that investment? How is it going to support a path to net zero? How is it going to deliver greater social impact? So part of the conversation around the value toolkit is that conversation with government departments and with clients to sort of say, what are those things, those value drivers that are important to you? And we've grouped them, we've worked with the Capitals Coalition, grouped them around 4 capitals, so human produced, natural and social capital. And that allows clients to engage with the market, with their advisors and with industry to sort of setting out, these are our key value drivers for our investment. And it helps industry develop a response that actually is tailored to meet those value drivers. So we don't go, what we've had historically in the past is some high strategic objectives that government sets out of the things they're seeking to achieve. And by the time it comes down to a project, it's procured on the basis of how cheap can I buy it and how much risk can I transfer to the supply chain. So actually it's enabling that conversation and enabling the advisors and the market to engage much earlier and much more strategically with clients to get their value profile understood and communicated. And what we hope to see through rolling this out, and we're running a pilot phase at the moment with about 140 organisations and clients in that space, is if you think about public sector clients here in the UK, they're all operating under broadly the same policy environment. You know, there might be some little local differences between education and justice, but broadly they're operating under the same policy environment. So that should mean their value drivers shouldn't be significantly different. That overall shape of their value profile should be about the same. It should allow a little bit of tweaks to meet the local needs of the users or the regional aspects, but broadly it's the same. And from the market then, if you're seeing what are key drivers for your clients across the public sector and the infrastructure market, you can start to tailor your offering to be much more attuned to hitting those value drivers. And the same applies when we've been speaking with private sector clients, as Julia said, around ESGs and how that is important and starting to shape their decisions ever more so.
I feel like we could spend another hour just exploring this question, and I do want to touch on risk as well. But before we do that, one of the many things you mentioned is about digitization in the future, and I'd like to direct my question to Alexandra on this. How, as the executive director for the Centre for Digital Built Britain, how are you encouraging greater use of data and digital tools to drive greater productivity? And the second piece to that is, what are some of the barriers to greater use of digital tools?
Thank you, Magda. That's a great question. So I'll start with what are the barriers. The barriers are sometimes just people simply not knowing they're there. But there is a perceived difficulty in some sectors of actually getting onto that digital transformation, particularly in the construction industry. We're looking at everybody from really big suppliers to one man and his van. So it's much more difficult for sole traders to get on the bandwagon. We need to be able to make sure that the industry has the right skills, and that's new people coming into the industry. So we're looking to do some work around graduate skills, making sure they leave universities and colleges with the right set of skills to manage digital transformation within construction. And we're even looking down at school children. So this is an exciting industry for them to go into. But we also need to upskill people who are currently within the construction industry to make sure that they understand and can use the tools that are available. Other hurdles that we need to make sure that we look at, make sure that we manage, making sure that there are proper standards in place, and that construction projects, infrastructure projects are commissioned using those standards and are held to those standards. So we're working with BSI, the UK Standards Authority, and the ISO to make sure that there are solid standards in place, so everybody's working to the same level of digitization, as it were. We also need to make sure that data is interoperable, because there is a lot of data held. Infrastructure projects create so much data. The problem isn't not having the data. The problem is, how do we use it? How do we make sure that we have the appropriate data? How do we make sure the data is better? So we talk about having the right data in the right hands at the right time, and that data is right. So using better data to make better decisions for a better future, and thinking about what data do you need, and helping industry understand what questions they need to ask at the beginning of a project, helping government understand what data might they need throughout the lifetime as a project, and how can they share that data? How can it be in a format that it can be shared between projects and between different phases of the same project? Because if we can share data better, if we can use data better, we will get more value out of our existing and new infrastructure. And one of the things I wanted to particularly add is that we've been talking a lot about new infrastructure, about new build, but we have to remember that we have a huge amount of existing infrastructure. 99% of the infrastructure we'll have in 5 years' time, we've already got it. And we need to use our data, we need to use our ways of working to use that infrastructure better if we're going to have any chance of making progress into the goals and visions that we've set for ourselves.
So the question for you as well as Keith on this then, and earlier we talked about various levels of government working together and collaborating, coordinating, and on this aspect of digital tools, how what's your advice on to getting local authorities to use digital tools?
We have a local authority working group, and we bring local authorities together. We talk with them. They're experts in their own field. They know how the local authorities work. They know a fair bit about digital transformation. It's great, but getting them to work together so we can see what are the blockers, the hurdles that they're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis, that we can hopefully work with industry, with government, central government and local governments to see how we can unblock and unlock those issues. But it's about providing support, it's about having conversations, but it's not in a command and control sense. It's about coordinating and aligning, finding the good practice that's out there and using those case studies, using those examples to help others in the same area to improve the way that they're managing their digital transformation.
I think that's, Alexandra raises a really good point about, providing that support, because I'm sure the same applies in any sort of devolved bodies internationally as well as in the UK. Our local authorities don't like being told what to do by central government, that sort of central diktat. But they do share the same ambitions of where they want to get to. So the importance of setting up these working groups and providing that peer support and external support is absolutely there. And I think Alexandra, mustn't lose Alexandra's really key point as well in the conversations when you're thinking about a Canadian infrastructure assessment. It's just recognizing the importance of the existing assets that you have and how they're managed and operated. Because if you are talking about delivering ambitious carbon and climate goals, you can't do that by ignoring what you've got and just focusing on the shiny new things you want to build. And how data can help you operate and manage those assets in a way that maybe prolongs their life or increases their availability. And all of those things are absolutely essential and central to an infrastructure assessment.
I was just going to say, I think just one other small dimension to this, and I really liked everything that guys were saying there, is when we did the London work, we wanted to create, sort of to Julia's point about the systems approach rather than a silo approach, a place where we could bring the different sectors together, where you would have the visibility, the opportunity to collaborate and share data, but also to sort of see the interface points so that you can start to build up that systems approach across the old systems and the new interventions. And just to say, kind of practical piece of advice, as we could maybe all guess, doing that in practice is unbelievably challenging, partly because, individual private sector organizations have views on what should be public, what's not public. Are there kind of a series of almost like concentric rings of what different people can access in that platform? But we did manage to make quite a lot of headway in the end, but it was through a lot of extensive engagement and really kind of digging under the surface of it, a bit like the approach that Digital Build Britain and the construction industry have taken. So I guess it's just thinking about, not just setting out a framework for how you want to do this, but what's the way of working that we're going to kind of design to underpin that, which is going to be almost like, daily and weekly working together to start to build up that picture, because it's not going to happen just by saying like, what a great idea, let's go off and do it. And I think that's some of the practical lessons from what's happened in the UK, both at the regional and at the national level.
And can I point out that the Commission continues to push for good quality data on infrastructure? Because I think, as I said right at the very beginning, when we were looking at procurement models and public and private sector delivery, what we found was that not sufficient data had been held in order to come up with an absolutely clear outcome as to how the processes had evolved. And I think it's incredibly important that we not only look at our existing data, the existing infrastructure that we have, collect the data on that, in the way that we've been talking about. But as we go forward, we are very strict in terms of collecting the data on the new build that we're doing as well. Because this is the only way, as we look out to 2050, that we're going to be able to judge different types of approaches. And sometimes I think this tends to be overlooked, or that people don't integrate this data in a systematic way in the way that I was speaking about.
Thank you.
And Magda, sorry, can I just jump in very briefly on that, because that's just sparked another thought that I was going to raise somewhere else, actually. I think that there's a brand new piece for everybody in terms of that long run, genuinely whole life thinking around infrastructure. It starts from what Keith was talking about, flows directly through what Alexandra and Julie were talking about. We have to think completely differently around who is going to be responsible for what in terms of what we learn from that data. Once we actually start to answer some of these big questions, we have never done that. No, I don't think anybody's really done that yet. So I do wonder actually whether there's an opportunity here, in a sort of a, almost around the world sense, around, where we know there are similar interests, to start to do some of this once and well, instead of each of us trying to invent a different way of doing it and discovering that none of them quite work. Anyway, it's just a thought.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to ask Danny to put his camera on and to respond from the Canadian side on the market. We've touched on a lot of different elements on implementation and digitization and policies in trying to implement in action what has been put forward through the assessment and strategy. We only have a few minutes left, and I would like to give the floor back to Gerard and Robert as well before we wrap up. But from a Canadian perspective and reacting to, I think, a few things that Keith has mentioned in the initiatives, Danny, do you have a few thoughts?
Yeah, I want to say that this part of the conversation has just totally got me all wound up here, Keith. I was jumping up and down as you were talking because it was just so relevant. And if anything, the items that you're suggesting in your toolbox, or some of the playbook initiatives that you're discussing, really highlight a lot of the things that I think the market here in Canada is recognizing on how the policy decisions and the objectives in the broader the way that we're looking at the whole life that Rachel talked about earlier. It starts to unravel as you get down through the various levels of government, to the point where when we finally see it hit the street, it's lost a lot of the direction that it was initially intended to actually address. We see it time and time again, And I think I want to put a double underscore in some of the discussions that you may be having to try to, bring those conversations back into, onto the radar of the stakeholders at the various levels of government as these procurements start to make their way to the boots on the ground. I want to highlight that for our Canadian colleagues, because I think that's where we've seen some of the great ideas kind of fall apart by the time they hit the market. So I really want to underscore that, and maybe we should spend a bit more time on that in a follow-up discussion later on. But I just want to highlight that before we go forward.
Thank you. Any other responses or questions from other panelists? If not, I believe Jeff had a final question for all. I still have quite a few questions I would love to ask all the panelists, but it seems we could continue and go on and on. I do want to give the floor back to Jeff for his final question, and then pass it to Gerard and Robert for any final remarks you may have.
Well, no, thanks, Magda. I've one very quick question for all panelists. 3 words. What are the key learnings from national infrastructure assessments Canada should take on board? For each of you, what would you say the top 3 criteria are in 3 words? And then hand Gerard over to you. So let's start with, on the first one on the screen is Rachel. So Rachel, then Isabel, then Tim, Keith, Alexandra, and Julia.
Suddenly not liking you very much, Jeff, but there we go, never mind. Thanks for that.
It was order of the screen.
Huge mistake to ask me just for 3 words, but there we go. Right, so I'll just give you 2 thoughts, actually, I think that just spring to mind. I think this piece around how Canada might take this forward, something that hasn't come up at all in this conversation, if and when you are thinking about who you might appoint as infrastructure commissioners or similar, on either a shorter or longer term timescale, they don't all have to be in Canada. Would be just a thought, in terms of how to engage more widely. And the second one would be around just that wider engagement, picking up on what several of us have talked about, and that disjointed, or the risk of disjointed, delivery on the ground relative to what you're trying to set out and start to do. The more engagement sort of all the way through that whole system, surely the better the outcomes will be.
Isabel.
I was going to say something similar to Rachel's second point there. First of all, what is the way of working we want in the industry in 5 years' time that's different from what we have today, that's going to deliver better outcomes, not us designing the better outcomes, right? And how do we use this process to create that? This is the start of that new way of working rather than an emanation of the old way of working. That's one thing. And however, the way that the Canadian infrastructure industry works will be similar to the way most infrastructure industries around the world work. And the second thing is this whole sort of like religious desire for certainty across the industry globally. And what happens is, we're doing the national infrastructure assessment. This will give us certainty. No, it won't. It'll just clarify further that there isn't certainty. So it's how do we put agility, flexibility, and uncertainty into the heart of this, and then build around that. So we don't get everyone disappointed at the outset. And actually, we need to kind of get over that hump at the beginning, not when everyone's disappointed at the end.
Tim?
I'm going to mention outcomes as one of my 3 words, because we all believe outcomes matter more than outputs. Placemaking has to be my second one, because actually that's the heart of what we're trying to do. We're trying to create the heart of communities, and actually place is much better than everything else. And my third one, I'm going to have to hyphenate slightly because it's 2 words, it's just transition. I think there's sort of many ways of actually trying to do this, but we need to create a better society. There's a super tech society with lots of Uber cars going all over the place. That's not a great future. There's actually a really nice one with 15-minute neighborhoods and people who are not so depressed because they go out more and meet their community. So I think actually just transition in all its broad sense has to be my third one.
Keith.
I'll go slightly off piste and say, just from my experience over the last 10 or 12 years, you'll have no trouble finding people who will say to you, this is really hard, this is why we can't do it. Make an effort to look out for people who say it's really hard, this is how we can do it. Find those people.
Alexandra?
I would say be really clear on what your vision is and make sure that that's not just financial, it's looking at the social and the economic and the environmental incomes that you want, not just build cost. And I would say think about how you can use financing, and particularly government financing, National Infrastructure Bank type financing, to be the levers to produce the infrastructure that you want. And one plea, please look at existing assets and whole life value. I know I've already said it, but it's really important, so I'm going to say it again.
Finally, Julia. You're on mute. You're on mute.
No 3 words at all if you're not speaking. Importance long-term and wherever possible apolitical thinking, driven through rigorous and data-driven approaches. Better infrastructure for all, the NIC strapline. I would say that assessments need to take into account the widest possible views of infrastructure. And I think embrace innovation, embrace new ideas. Now that's a lot more than 3 words, but it's 3 ideas.
Thank you all so much for your time today. Last final words from Gerard.
Thanks so much for both the organizers and everyone. What a luxury to have some leading thinkers just kind of talk exactly about the problems that we're dealing with every day. So just an incredible indulgence, and thank you so much for your time. The discussion, I won't try to sort of provide any grand wrap up. But some of these conversations around, thinking about things as a system, national as well as place-based, some of the ways that pipelines can be either incredibly useful or fail to live up to their billing. Mention of things like skills, standards, sufficient and high-quality data. And yes, of course, the challenge of factoring in existing infrastructure as well as new. All of these are wonderful points. The main takeaway for me is around outcomes, and Isabel, I think you kind of framed it as an opportunity for Canada to kind of look at some of the connections between our infrastructure investments and driving outcomes. And in some cases it'll be how they do, and in some cases it'll be how they aren't capable of doing. But I interpret that, and I hope all of my colleagues here in Canada interpret that as a challenge that we can take on together. It'll certainly require that we have that sound methodology and that sound and solid reliance on data. That's going to be our key to establishing something that's independent and credible. And message received as well on the notion that we need to involve the right people. If we want to get to an outcome, we need to involve the folks who are, going to help us, or the folks who, if not in the tent, kind of will stand in our way. And I think that's, incredibly useful message for you to have underscored. So thank you again.
Thank you all so much. John, do you have any administrative messages?
No administrative messages. The recording will be available, but just to reiterate, thank you to everybody for taking this time in your day and really sort of sharing some hugely valuable insights. So thank you very much again, and thanks to everybody for joining, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.